Hi guys, I'm finally live. Yay, sorry, I'm like 2 minutes late. I try to be on time, but sometimes it just doesn't happen that way. I'm just gonna wait for everyone to join. While everyone joins, I'll take you to, I put a recording sign on my office door so nobody bothers me. It's fine. All right. Hey guys. Sorry, I was just putting my recording sign on my office door so no one bothers me while I'm recording. And I'm going to wait for everyone to join. Hey guys, thanks for taking your time. We're going to just talk about wellness. You guys can ask whatever questions. This is just an open Q&A. I am sipping on one of the drinks that will be featured in Fully Nourished. It's a liver and kidney detox drink. It has a tablespoon of chlorophyll, 2 tablespoons of cranberry, organic cranberry, a squeeze of lemon, and some filtered water and some collagen. Okay, we're getting our questions right away. So when should I take progesterone? When I'm having a 21-day cycle, I'm in perimenopause. Well, when you're taking progesterone, you must be tracking your ovulation because sometimes it can end up being a barrier to ovulation. So I recommend women first start tracking their cycles, learning if they're even ovulating. Once you know when you ovulate, you want to be supplementing your progesterone afterwards. A lot of functional medicine doctors and practitioners will tell you take it from days 14 to 28 because it's assumed that a woman is ovulating around day 14. But if you're ovulating late in the cycle, like day 18, 19, 20, supplementing progesterone on day 14 can actually stop you from ovulating because your body's like, oh, there's already progesterone. Wait, it kind of is confusing a little bit. So you want to, as well as possible, wait till after you ovulate, but obviously you need to know when you're ovulating and if you're ovulating. So if you're not ovulating, then you just take it from 14 all the way up until your next period. But if you are ovulating, you kind of want to wait until after you ovulate. And if you're ovulating later on in the cycle, the progesterone might lengthen your luteal phase just a little bit. How long does it take for Dutch test results to usually come in? It takes about 10 business days from the day that they receive the test. Usually your practitioner, if you're running it through a practitioner, has like a back end portal where they can see like when the lab receives it and if it's still in the testing process. Sometimes Dutch will mess something up and they'll need to retest a specific part of your sample. So sometimes if it's taking a little longer than 10 business days, you can call them and they'll tell you oh, we had to retest something, or they'll let you know, but it should take around 10 business days. Best option to get calcium if all dairy causes acne too much. Yeah, so I completely understand. Remember that dairy won't always do that if you heal. That's not your forever. It's just for a period of time when things are moving too slow through the small intestine, or the small intestine is really irritated with an overgrowth of bacteria, or is very leaky. You have low progesterone or hypothyroidism. All those things can impair your digestion of dairy. And until you fix those things, it's going to be difficult to digest dairy, and dairy can cause symptoms. And so, honestly, it's people need to understand that it's very difficult to get enough calcium without dairy. A lot of people will say greens are a great source of calcium, and they are, but they are very difficult to digest raw. So you must cook them. So I recommend, getting well-cooked greens regularly. I also recommend making a greens broth once a week and sipping on that daily, and then also making yourself some eggshell calcium. So all you have to do is get some really high quality eggs, preferably pastured or from the local farmer. Wash the outsides really, really well. Make your eggs like you normally do, but set these eggshells aside, set them out on a paper towel, put them in the sun to dry, and then once they're very fully dry, you would just put them in a coffee grinder, grind them up into a powder, and there's your eggshell calcium powder. If you don't want to make it, you can always buy it, but to me, it's easy enough to make. So that's a great way to supplement. I would start with a very small amount of that because you can get too much and it can be irritating and hard on the stomach. So, you want to just start very, very light with that. But overall, I just recommend doing lots and lots of cooked greens and greens broths, and then also the eggshell calcium. Do you have any suggestions for bowel movements always being incomplete? Yeah, so that shows that peristalsis is still impaired. You probably still are slightly constipated. A lot of people think that when they're going to the bathroom, they're not constipated. And I'm like, if you're not getting a full bowel movement, you're not clearing out that whole large intestine, then you probably are still constipated. So, that a lot of times you can utilize aloe vera for that, magnesium citrate powder. Your goal is to kind of get peristalsis moving again. I also really like motility boosters like Motil Pro, and ginger is a great one. I recommend something called, I created something for my clients called Fire Tea, where you brew some ginger for about 10 minutes, and then you also add ginger powder and a little bit of raw honey, and that usually really works on motility. So it's one of those things where you need to actually work on the motility of your gut and then also strengthening the colon. So a lot of times women don't realize that you're supposed to poop in a squat position. And if you're not in a squat position, you are getting an incomplete bowel movement because your bowels are kind of squished a little bit. So you need to invest in a squatty potty or getting some books underneath your feet, making sure you're in a squatting position. And that usually does the trick when you're having an incomplete bowel movement. Why are we more hungry on our periods? Because you need more energy, and a lot of women undereat their whole cycle and it catches up with them while they're on their periods. So it's a good rule of thumb to make sure you're eating consistently and enough, specifically that last half of your cycle, and then understand that when you're being depleted, you're bleeding, right? You're giving off a lot of energy. You're detoxifying, you're bleeding, so you're being depleted. And a lot of us don't slow down during our periods, which is a bad idea, but it's really good to make sure you're listening to your hunger signals. Your blood sugar is a little bit more imbalanced during that time because your hormones are at their lowest, and so you're gonna feel a lot more hungry. And I recommend usually when you're on your period eating 5 to 7 small meals every 2 hours on the dot, setting a timer and making sure you're nourishing yourself even though you're not hungry. A lot of women are like, I'm not hungry on my period, I don't feel good, and I'm like, please eat, because partially, when you're that nausea, partial hunger on your period where you're not hungry but you're craving things, that's almost identical thing that's going on during pregnancy. And so only on a smaller scale. So you know how morning sickness comes when you're pregnant? It's kind of similar. It's your hormones are so low, have dropped so low that they can really mess with your blood sugar. And so it's really important to make sure you're getting enough salt and sodium, and it's really important to make sure you're just consistently eating and eating enough. Because a lot of us don't eat enough on our periods, and then by the end of the day we're starving and we're oh, we have such bad period cravings, and I'm it's probably because your body is super undernourished. You got to feed yourself well. I've looked into Ray Peat after hearing you and others mention him, and it was overwhelming. How much of his work do you use in your practice? I don't really focus on how much of his work I focus on. I take a lot of his principles that I think are very important, but it's a lot, right? I've been studying him for over a year and a half now. So it's it's one of those things where you kind of just have to take it in chunks, but pretty much broken down is I think a lot of what he says is on point about digestion and hormones like estrogen and progesterone, and then also fats like polyunsaturated fats. But again, whenever it comes to following somebody, your goal is not to follow someone to a T. It's more about taking principles that make sense, right? It just makes sense. It's common sense. The body's not this rocket scientist thing that only certain people with certain amounts of smarts can understand. Everyone should be able to understand the body, and it should make common sense in your head. If something does not seem right, it probably is not right. And so for me, a lot of his work just makes sense. It's duh, and for me, it's he just kind of pulls together a lot of wellness ideas and really fights against mainstream fad diet advice, which is what I really, really like. Anytime something is being overhyped or overpreached, I always ask myself, is this true? Is this science, or is this just marketing? And a lot of times when something is just overhyped and overfad and people are spitting out non-scientific facts, it's usually just a fad. And so I really like how he dives into the science, but I know that it is very overwhelming. Ray Peat's very overwhelming, but because he's just so smart. But I recommend maybe starting with one of his articles, dissecting it, and then moving on to the next article. But that's what I'm for. That's what people like clinicians like me are for. We take a lots of information. We take certain conditions. We take people that are, like people that are really struggling metabolically, and we translate that information into actionable steps for people who are busy or just overwhelmed with the science. But I use quite a bit of his work in my practice. He's not the only one. I draw ideas from different practitioners that I love and respect, but I'm very, very careful now as to who I follow and how much references they have and where their science is coming from and all that stuff. Like if somebody's telling me like, oh, I'm going to quote, they tell me something like that's science-based and then they link me to like a blog post, I'm not, or like give me a picture of a book, I'm like, probably not. Like I need to see the people that I look up to and that I learn from, they are quoting direct scientific resources. Reasons you might not get a period, especially if you've always been extremely regular. Did you start any new supplements? Did you start restricting calories? Did you start restricting a certain food? Are you more stressed out than normal? Where were you 3 months ago in your cycle? Because remember, it takes 3 months for your habits to affect your cycle. So whenever you're having a problem now with ovulating, because it's not a period missing. Remember, it's an ovulation missing, because when you stop ovulating, you stop getting a period. Whenever you miss a period, your goal is to say, okay, 2 weeks ago, what happened? Because that's what came late. Ovulation came late, or ovulation is late. And so what's going on now that's lengthening your follicular phase? And then what has happened in the past 100 days? Because a lot of times what happened 3 months ago or 60 days ago is what's going to affect your cycle right in the now. Let's look for the next question. I asked you about ancestral NDT. Still a bit confused if I'm actually getting T3 and T4. I remember you said that you get the whole gland, but does that mean all of the Ts? Yes, so you're getting all of the Ts that are condensed into the thyroid, which is not as much as, like I said, when you do natural desiccated thyroid medication, they are extracting the individual T1, T2, T3 from these glandulars, separating them, and then they actually take, T1 and put it in, T2 and put it in a certain amount, T3 and put it in. So it's a compounded or a manufactured medication, whereas the ancestral supplements one is literally the whole gland dried up, powdered, and put into a capsule. And so yes, they both contain T3 and T4, because remember, the porcine glandular, the natural desiccated thyroid medication has extracted from the gland, but remember that the medication is a lot more concentrated because there are certain compounds that are being extracted from the gland, whereas the glandular supplement, that's ancestral supplements, is just the whole gland powdered. And so it's not as concentrated in T3 and T4, but the whole gland will contain some T3 and some T4. I hope that makes sense. Hey Jessica, do you find drinking lots of cow's milk causes weight gain? No, it actually causes the opposite. One of the biggest lies is that dairy is like super inflammatory. And this is just not true. Of course, it's important what your cows ate. It's also important, what additives are in your dairy, because if you're like consuming a lot of dairy that has synthetic vitamins that are irritating your gut lining, that's going to absolutely cause inflammation. Or if your milk has carrageenan or guar gum, or if the cows that made your milk were eating GMO corn and soybeans, that's very different than a cow that just grazed on grass, got sunshine, and ate what it was supposed to eat. Cows eat grass. That's what they're supposed to eat. So I don't find that. If anything, I think it helps me stay at a very lean weight. They've actually done multiple studies on this in Europe, and they do find that people that have higher dairy diets are comparably less of a body fat percentage and a healthier BMI than people who do not consume dairy or do not consume a lot of dairy products. So calcium-rich foods really drive metabolic stability. Remember, anytime that you have low calcium, your body is in a absolutely stressed out state. Almost everyone now that's cut out dairy is not getting enough calcium. Unless you're drinking a greens broth every single day, if you're consuming 4 to 6 cups of cooked greens, and you're not, that is what you would need to get enough calcium. And it's just not happening for most women. They're not realizing that they're walking around with low calcium levels. And so I think that the pros outweighs the cons. If you don't tolerate it, then that is a sign that you need to do some serious healing. It's not a sign that dairy is bad. It's a sign that your body can't tolerate a basic traditional food that your ancestors have been able to consume for thousands of years with no problem. There's a problem. It's not like, oh, dairy is bad. It might be bad for you right now if it's super inflammatory to you, if your gut cannot digest it, but there's a reason why that's happening. It's not that dairy is the problem. It's that the body is disrupted and imbalanced. So I do not believe dairy causes weight gain. If anything, I think it helps with weight loss once you can tolerate it and digest it. Chlorophyll lemonade. Do you use liquid or powder chlorophyll? Particular brand you like? I use World Organic, and it is a liquid. I just find it's easier to mix into cold water. Hi, Jessica. What's the best way to reintroduce dairy after not drinking milk for several years? Yeah, so obviously, if you don't use it, you lose it. Remember, you need a specific enzyme to break down dairy, lactase, and dairy has a special sugar in it called lactose. It's one of the most wonderful sugars for your liver, and it's so incredibly, just so therapeutic. To me, dairy is one of the best anti-stress drinks because casein protein and whey protein blended together completely cools the stress response. And so all those people that say that, dairy is addictive, it's like an opioid. I'm like, hell yeah, it is. It makes you secrete dopamine, and dopamine chills you the F down, which is what most women need. And so for me, yeah, it is a therapeutic food. Duh, it does. It's not heroin. What the heck? So, anyways, long story short is you're not going to be able to digest it well at first. It's going to take about 3 weeks to rebuild up those lactase enzymes. And you might find that if you don't tolerate it well, or you still have some bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine, remember there's 3 things that really impair our digestion of dairy. It is your small intestines are either overgrown with bacteria. Remember, the small intestine should stay sterile, or your microvilli are worn down from inflammation and irritation in the gut. The second reason would be that you have low progesterone. Progesterone is needed to make lactase enzymes. And then the third thing is hypothyroidism also impairs dairy digestion because you need T3 in order to make lactase enzymes as well. And so whenever you tie it in and you're not tolerating it well after 30 days, you might still have some of those underlying issues going on. But most people actually find that they tolerate it quite well. They just thought they didn't because they were eating dairy that had a bunch of additives in it that were irritating them, and the dairy itself wasn't a problem. So the best thing you can do is, if you have access in your estate to raw dairy, I would start with just raw milk, and you do about 2 ounces at a meal. So for an example, choose breakfast and just do 2 ounces with your meal and see how you go. You want to start with the purest form of dairy, which is milk, right? It's its whole form. Once you can find, you do 2 ounces a day for a week or 2, you feel okay, then you would move it up to 4 ounces. Kind of go intuitively. It doesn't have to be done perfectly. If you feel like you're tolerating the 2 ounces well, move up to 4 ounces, and then move up to 6, and so on and so forth. If you don't tolerate raw dairy very well, sometimes actually having pasteurized dairy can be more beneficial for people that are sensitive, because remember that mother's milk, regardless of if it's human, cow, goat, whatever, it's full of probiotics. It's full of bacteria, which is good, right? We want to crowd out the bad bacteria with the good bacteria. It's just like a probiotic. Dairy is one of the most healing drinks you can get on the planet for your gut. But if you have a really disrupted gut, the bacteria in that milk might cause more problems. It's just like when you eat, a probiotic, you take a probiotic and it really irks you. It's the same thing. So sometimes pasteurizing the dairy and killing all the bacteria still provides you with the nutrients without the bacteria. Now, obviously, raw milk is a better source. It's more nutrient dense. It has more enzymes, all that good stuff. But you want to work up to that. So if you don't tolerate raw dairy products well, you might tolerate homogenized, pasteurized, because homogenized, all it means is that they blend it really quickly to blend the fat with the sugar so that it's the fat is broken up instead of concentrated at the top. And then pasteurized just means all the bacteria has been killed. And even ultra pasteurized, sometimes people can't even handle pasteurized, so it's you need ultra pasteurized milk. And if you tolerate that, then it's actually the bacteria that's really wrecking your gut. And so those are kind of my tricks, is sometimes people do better on pasteurized milk for a little while until they get their guts kind of in a better place. But you always want to opt for grass-fed. I like one called Grass Milk by Organic Valley. But yeah, you introduced it slowly. And then once you could tolerate milk, I should have gone on. Once you can tolerate milk, then you want to try cheese, see how that goes. Cream and grass-fed butter tend to be the easiest digested dairy foods, because remember, cream and butter are the same thing, you guys. I know people are like, oh my god, I don't do dairy, but I do grass-fed butter, and I'm like, secret's out, but dairy or butter is cream, like just in a different form. So, you know, like it's okay to drink cream if you do butter. If I had a short luteal phase for years, been really working on healing whole body, post-IVF, keto, dieting, and I finally had a full 14-day luteal phase, is this a sign that I'm starting to heal? Yes, that's a wonderful sign, especially if you've had a short luteal phase for a very long time. That's a wonderful sign. Congratulations. So, you know, once you start to see your cycle regulating, it can be really, really exciting because it does take time. Like a lot of people, when their periods are beginning to start again, they think that they're just going to get a full period right away. And I'm like, no, think of it's like a rusty wheel that's kind of like starting to move again. The first couple turns are going to be kind of rough. So, you know, just keep an eye on it. You want 3 consecutive regular ovulatory cycles that are pretty on the dot regular. And that is a great sign that you're moving in the right direction though. Every cycle should be gradually better once you change your habits until the point where your cycle is just like a non-issue. Like you're in sync, you're good, like everything's flowing the proper way. Food sensitivity test shows high sensitivity to eggs and dairy. Recommend to remove. Leaky gut concept valid, and these foods leading to inflammation. I think that food sensitivity tests are complete bullshit, just my opinion, because the thing is, it's like, okay, for example, let's say you got, you know, the chicken pox when you were a kid, and you have chicken pox antibodies in your bloodstream. Does that mean that you have chicken pox right at this very moment? No, it does not. Your body, your immune system took care of it, handled it. You now have antibodies against it. IgG, it shows that you attacked that at one time in your life. And it's the same thing for foods. I do not understand why people act like you are actively attacking that food every single day of your life. You could have just attacked eggs at one point in your life and you still have an antibody against it in your bloodstream. It boggles my mind. Anyways, so, you know, a lot of people make the mistake of cutting out a million things on their food sensitivity test and then eating a bunch of things that they're physically reacting to. But because the test said differently, they're going to cut the foods out that are the most healing and most nutrient dense because a test told them. And yet their body is telling them something very different. The only accurate food sensitivity test is an elimination diet. And that is the only thing that's accurate, unfortunately. Some people see success with eliminating food sensitivities, but most people just experience food anxiety. They are very restricted under eating most of the time, and they are nutrient deficient. I mean, like eggs and dairy, like super deliver all of these fat soluble vitamins, vitamins A, D, E, K, that are necessary for liver detoxification. And then you also have to ask yourself, if you're going to cut eggs and dairy, the most bioavailable sources of protein on the planet, where are you going to get your protein from? So if you're going to do all muscle meat, that's a problem. That's acidic. So then it's like, okay, so I'm going to do muscle meat and collagen. Can you sustain that for whatever amount of time you're going to do it? Because if you have leaky gut, you can't handle plant proteins either. And so this is like where, you know, people, practitioners, just they do this cookie cutter approach, and I just get really irritated, because if you understand the physiology of the gut, you know cutting eggs and dairies completely eliminates a huge source of protein, and somebody has to give me that answer as to where they're going to get their protein instead. Don't tell me beans and rice, because you can't digest beans and rice if your gut is irritated. So where is it going to come from? It's going to come from soy. That's really irritating and estrogenic. So where is it going to come from? And that's when we decide to eliminate foods, we need to not only say, I'm going to eliminate this food, but I'm going to replace it with XYZ. And a lot of women come to me that cut out a food, but they didn't do the second step. And so here they are, nutrient deficient, stressed out, their hair's falling out, you know, their period's still gone, all this crap. And I'm like, yeah, because we can't cut nutrient-dense foods and not take on the responsibility of replacing them. I hope that makes sense, but I think that people just don't think through the whole thing, and this goes for practitioners, this is not you, and they don't realize that if you're restricting a nutrient-dense food, you must take on that responsibility of replacing the nutrients that you are going to be missing from that food. What causes low serotonin and dopamine? Any advice for raising? I think serotonin is not the happy hormone like everyone says. It quickens your motility. It's a stress hormone. It raises when people are stressed out. I don't know why people call it the happy hormone. Whenever I see, but you want enough, you just don't want too much. Usually when you have low estrogen, you have low serotonin because they work synergistically. They're both antagonists or protagonists. And dopamine is one of those things. The biggest thing is just the way that I raise people's dopamine is I give them sugar. Like, people are like, oh my gosh, how do I raise dopamine? I'm going to spend thousands of dollars on supplements. And I'm like, why don't you just go put some raw honey in your freaking food? Like, let's be real here. So dopamine is that happy, feel good hormone. Get in a good relationship, do things that you love and enjoy, stop being so stressed out and doing things that you hate, start saying no more often, start being happier. And then make sure you're eating things that you really love and enjoy, make sure you're eating plenty of sugar and keeping your blood sugar balanced, and your body will do the rest. If we should avoid PUFAs, does that mean seed cycling isn't ideal? I personally think that seed cycling is hilarious. Some people say that it helps with their digestion and everything. So, for example, if someone's coming from you always have to take the person into account. So let's say someone's coming from a standard American diet and they are consuming absolute crap, no fiber, whatever, and they are seed cycling is actually improvement, right? Because we're getting fiber in to bind to estrogen and carry it out of the body. But let's say someone is 5 years into their healing journey. They've tried everything, keto, paleo, blah, 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 blah. They're still eating tons of nuts and seeds and nothing's healing, right? Their gut's not healing, their liver's not healing. What's going on? You should be good by now. It's been 5 years, what the heck? So at that point, let's quit the seeds and nuts. Let's see if that helps. And 9 times out of 10, you guys, I'm serious. I swear on my life that when somebody cuts nuts and seeds for a month, they are like, oh my gosh, why have I been eating so many nuts and seeds? What the heck? I feel a million times better. My gut works better because they're just so irritating to the gut. And most women, unless you have a very robust digestive system and your gut is completely good, which because you're here, I'm assuming it's probably not, it's so difficult to digest nuts and seeds. I wish I could, I'm going to explain it more in Fully Nourished, just why they're so difficult to digest. But I've explained it a few times here, but yes, the individual compounds found in nuts and seeds may be good, but it would be super cool if you could actually digest those compounds without them irritating the hell out of you. I hope that makes sense. Can you briefly describe what your Candida protocol looks like? Yes. So the biggest mistake people make when they're doing a Candida protocol is they stop consuming all sugar. The problem with this is Candida is an opportunistic organism. It doesn't just lay down and die and say, oh, I'm starving, I'm just gonna lay here and shrivel up. No, Candida gets freaking vicious and it starts to send its little finger-like nasty projections through your gut walls, which can actually rip open the cells and get into your bloodstream. And that's how it becomes systemic. It gets into your sinuses, it gets into your lungs sometimes, and it even gets into your vagina, hence a yeast infection. And so people act like, oh, I'm starving my Candida. And I'm like, you're not starving it, it's just getting mad. And sometimes it becomes more resistant to antifungals then. So you do need to eat the right carbohydrates. You can't cut carbs because a lot of times people, they starve their Candida, which makes it angrier, and then they're also stressing out their hormones and slowing down their metabolism while they're on such a low carb diet. So you have to be very strategic with your carbs. I recommend getting carbs from simply dairy, ripe tropical fruit, honey. That's it. And people are like, oh my gosh, Jessica, but I'm like, isn't that better than not eating carbs at all? Starches tend to feed bacteria and fungus more than easy to digest sugars, like what I just said. So, my Candida protocol first looks like we're doing a very, very anti-inflammatory diet. I mean, no roughage whatsoever, nothing to feed, because remember, bacteria feed on cellulose. So if you're doing tons of leafy greens and tons of cruciferous vegetables, you're just feeding them, they're just like yum. So we do lots of just well cooked, squash and zucchini and bell pepper and fruits like papaya and pineapple, just easy to digest mushy foods. And then lots and lots of bone broths, lots of gut healing foods. And then no PUFAs, so no nuts, no seeds, all coconut oil, ghee, grass-fed butter. And then on the flip side, we're also doing antifungals. So, things like endocillinic acid, oregano oil, diatomaceous earth, what else do I use? Like berberine sometimes, just like the general antifungals. I like one called FC Cidal on Amazon. And then after we wipe them out, then we go back and sometimes we'll implement a strategic probiotic with strategic strains. But this is why I love running the GI map, because I want to know what you have. I want to know what bacteria and fungus you have. Remember, fungus never is alone. Fungus never is alone. There's always bacteria overgrowth or parasites or both when it comes to fungus. It's very rarely your only issue. And so this is where it's like, okay, you do a fungal protocol and you kind of get better, but you don't get fully better. And it's because there wasn't just fungus in there, my friend. There was more. And then it just goes, it's like this vicious cycle. So many women are like on this self-healing journey, and they're like, they do the Candida diet for 3 months and they feel kind of better, and then they take 5 steps back, and then, it's like this constant just 5 steps forward, 4 steps back, 5 steps forward, 4 steps back. And I'm like, you have to, if you're going to heal the gut, do it right. Just do it right so you can save yourself the headache. Since coming off of birth control 3 months, I've had 2 periods. This month, though, I've been having spotting. Why could this be? A lot of times, if you're having regular spotting during the mid-cycle every single month, that is a sign that you should check your thyroid. If it's just kind of like a random thing, maybe make sure you're tracking ovulation. Do you know if you've ovulated the past 2 periods? That's important information to know, because you could just be ovulating for the first time. So there's like multiple reasons. I would just personally, if it was me, I would keep an eye on it. If it continued to happen over the course of multiple cycles, I would definitely get to my doctor as quick as possible and get my thyroid checked, TSH, T4, T3. If you can get the freeze, like free T3, T4, great, but you just want the basics, TSH, T4, T3 at least. And then you just kind of like, again, it's just you want to pay attention, but you want to make sure you 2 things, you're checking in with ovulation and then you're checking in with thyroid. I've been on a Just Cash Wellness highlight binge. Since some of your positions have shifted with growth and wisdom, I need some clarity. Yes, I've been meaning to go back and delete certain highlights that I no longer align with. There's a lot of content on here, because I've been creating content for almost 2 years now. So there's a lot of content that's older and maybe doesn't reflect my current views any longer. And so I need to make sure that I go through that and clarify, because I don't want to confuse you guys. When dealing with cortisol and stress issues, you recommend eating every 2 hours, but with insulin resistance, you advise not to snack. Where do I start? So I've completely changed my position on snacking, and I'm going to take that away. I have recently, just with some science, current science coming out, and then looking over just people's stances on intermittent fasting, there are reasons for why they're promoting intermittent fasting. To me, is just not good enough any longer. In a perfect world, if you had a perfectly functioning liver, you could fast for up to 12 hours, no problem, with no stress response. But we don't live in a perfect world, and most of us have under-functioning livers. So our livers cannot really sustain us for more than 2 hours when our liver is stressed out. And then our body has to remember, stress hormones' main role is to raise cortisol, we raise adrenaline to break down our own tissues to turn them into glucose to keep blood glucose levels stable. I no longer believe that insulin resistance is a driving factor. I believe it is actually a cause of stress and a cause of gut inflammation. So I have to go back and change those, but thank you for asking. My view on insulin resistance has completely changed and shifted, and my view on snacking has completely shifted. So I believe that balancing blood sugar is paramount, and the minute you wake up, you should start eating within an hour, and you should eat right before you go to bed as well, because most women who are metabolically impaired do not need to stress their bodies out anymore. They need to tell their body it's time to burn fuel properly by taking out foods that are inflammatory so that the cells will respond to insulin better, and by giving their body the fuel it needs to support proper cell function. I hope that makes sense, and I hope you guys understand that as I move and as I learn and as I've grown in wisdom and knowledge, I always change my views. And I know it can sometimes be confusing, but there's a lot of people on Instagram that I feel are a little bit inauthentic because they're so married to their views, whether they've created a product that supports a certain view. And so now if they shifted their view, they would have to completely change their products. People buy, thousands of dollars worth of product from them, and it's based on a shoddy view now. They can't change their view. So they're almost married to their view due to their business. And I just refuse to do that. If new science and knowledge occurs, I need to be able to shift to present that to you. And nutrition science is always changing, you guys, and I try to stay on top of it as much as possible, which can sometimes come off as confusing, but in hindsight, I see that everybody is not perfect. And as you learn and grow in your practice and gain experience of what works and doesn't work with women, you have the responsibility to change and shift, or you're lying. You're lying. That's what it is. You're lying. And I just refuse to be a liar. I would always be more authentic with you guys and real and confuse the hell out of you than lie and just act like something is right and going to help you when it might not. So I always make sure that I have so much research before I even shift my views publicly, but I have to go back and delete some stories so there's no more confusion, and I will redo them with a more updated version of that information. Been struggling with short luteal phases since going off hormonal birth control 9 months ago. Thoughts on boosting progesterone? I have a progesterone boosting story. I hope you've watched it. If not, it's just labeled progesterone. That's where I would start. B vitamins are very important for ovulation. If you're inflamed, like you have really bad digestive function, that's important. If you're on a restrictive diet, that's another thing. Remember that birth control depletes you of nutrients. And so there's all these people that are like, well, you're getting the recommended daily allowance of vitamins and minerals. And I'm like, you understand that the recommended daily allowance was started to be made up in the Great Depression to figure out what people needed to get so they don't die, right? There's a very big difference between getting enough so you don't die and getting enough nutrients to heal. And a lot of people do not understand this concept. They think like, oh, I'm getting the recommended daily allowance, I'm good. And I'm like, you need to make sure you're digesting that, you're absorbing that, and you're getting mostly more than the recommended daily allowance, like an abundance of vitamins and minerals and nutrients into your diet. So, make sure you're eating enough, make sure you're not calorie restricting unintentionally, make sure you're eating pretty regularly to balance blood sugar and lower stress hormones, and make sure your thyroid is in a good place. And those are kind of the 3 things I would recommend for short luteal phases. Hey Jess, I'm wondering, should we be keeping track of macros? Should we make sure we're eating more protein, fat than carbs at a meal, or just making sure meals with carbs have some fat and protein? Yeah, so I don't really recommend like macro tracking to a T. Sometimes it can be very helpful if people have no idea what macronutrients are. Like if you don't know what on your plate is protein and what on your plate is carbs and what on your plate is fat, then it's probably a good idea to track macros for just a little while to learn about your food. It's very informative, but I don't recommend obsessing over numbers. The only number that I really recommend is minimums. So I think that every woman should be getting a minimum of 100 grams of bioavailable protein per day. I'm not talking that freaking hemp protein that you're eating. That's probably giving like 15% of the protein that it says on the package. So, I mean, bioavailable sources of protein that your body is digesting and absorbing. If you have impaired digestion, you can suspect that you are barely absorbing the protein from plant proteins and absorbing the protein from meat a little better, but probably not as well as you should. So it's very important to add an abundance of bone broth and an abundance of collagen in, which are very easy to digest proteins. And then, so you want to be getting 100 grams of protein minimum per day, depending. Remember, too much protein can lower blood sugar. So you don't, to a point where it creates a stress response. So again, it's like about getting balance. I recommend like 100 grams, but don't be like, the more the better. It's like, no, you just want to like get a balance. And then when it comes to carbohydrates, this is really where hormones really play a role. So people don't understand that if you have really low T3, low progesterone, high estrogen, carbs are going to blow you up like a mofo. Like they will, because your body is not processing glucose. If your cells are under stress, your cells refuse glucose and burn free fatty acids. So you need to be burning glucose well before you actually make pound the glucose. So a lot of women don't realize that they're consuming a low carb diet. They don't realize they're on a low carb diet, but they count their carbohydrates and they're like, wow, I ate 50 grams of carbs today. And I'm like, yeah, you're on a low carb diet. And your endocrine glands are super stressed. So in that case, you would want to know how much carbs you're consuming first and foremost. Then you would want to slowly increase them and make sure it's balanced throughout meals. You don't want to ever snack on just carbs. That's a no-no for really anybody. You should always make sure that your meals deliver protein, carb, and fat. Fat-wise, I don't really think that people have to like overly add fat to their meals. Like a lot of meats, if you're eating a full meat that's not like low fat beef. Like there's already fat in there. If you add some ghee to your sweet potato, there's some fat. You don't need to like overly add fat to your meal. I think that like a moderate amount of fat is good, but like I don't think this high fat thing is doing women any favors either. There's too little fat, but then there's also like too much fat. So, it's not about being obsessed with it. It's just making sure that your blood sugar is staying stable. Like you're feeling balanced, you're feeling grounded, your body's warming up after you eat. You're feeling satisfied. You're not feeling hungry like 30 minutes later. So yes, it's more about making sure you're getting enough protein at a meal, but also enough carbs, because if you're just eating protein without carbs, protein's going to drop your blood sugar super, super low, which is stressful for the liver as well. So you just want to make sure you're getting around a certain amount of carbs, and that's different for every single woman. Unfortunately, like some women need to gauge where they're actually at. If you're at 25 grams of carbohydrates and I tell you to eat 150 grams and you go and bump them up, like that's like quadrupling or more your carbohydrates, you're gonna gain weight. So it's like you gotta slowly integrate and see where you're at first with carbs and then slowly move them up. And then the type of carbs totally matter. So roots and fruits and like raw honey and maple syrup are going to be your best friends. Grain carbs, if you are very intolerant to carbs, this is the biggest mistake that people make. When they're on keto, they like restrict all carbohydrates. And then when they're off keto, they like pound the bread. And I'm like, there's a healthy medium there. Like we don't want to get all of our carbs from bread, guys. So it's like really focus on roots and fruits. And a lot of people are like, what kinds of fruits? Like berries, because they're low sugar. And I'm like, no, let's actually focus on easy to digest fruits that don't have seeds in them. Like you can have berries, but don't just eat berries. Like this is why women binge on sugar all the time, because they're like, I don't eat sugar. And then I'm like, okay. They're like, sugar is addictive. And I'm like, okay. And then they're like, but I eat berries. And then I'm like, okay. And then they're like, but I binged on a whole pint of ice cream last night. And I'm like, okay. So it's like, you have to see things clearly. If you are restricting sugar and restricting carbs, you're like, I only get my sugar from berries. And then you're like binging at the end of the week on just every carb in sight. Like, why don't we just tie in some healthy carbohydrates for breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner, so you never feel restricted from carbs again and you never have a binge again because your body's actually nourished. So make sure there's a carb at every meal. Carbs are not bad. Make sure there's enough fat to keep you satiated and balanced, and then make sure there's enough protein to make sure that carbs are not spiking your blood sugar too high. That was a long answer for a basic question. I'm sorry. What can cause mucus in stools? So many things can cause mucus in stools. It's not always a bad thing, but if it's happening a lot, then there's something overproducing mucus in your stool. And you would want to look at what supplements you're on. Maybe something's very irritating to your body and it's making it overproduce mucus. Maybe you have some parasites or bacteria or fungus like over creating their biofilms, which is that kind of like mucousy house that pathogens build for themselves. So there could be quite a few reasons why there's mucus in there. Also, I'm new to your page and very grateful for all that you share. However, going through some of your past information, some of it is very different to now, and I am quite confused. Yeah, I would just recommend sticking to what's more recent. Obviously, over time, things changed, and always look at the date of a post. I've been on Instagram for quite some time now, and so as a practitioner, views have changed. Just like anybody else. So I don't always post every single day. So some of the information might seem pretty recent, but it could be from 6 months to a year ago. So I would stick to my more recent stuff. There's a lot of relevant information in the past posts, but as I've changed my views and like I've said, there's a lot of fad things going on, and I'm a newer practitioner, over 3.5 years or so. So even though I've been in the health and wellness community for over 8 years, I've, kind of slowly changed my views as I've started, as I've gained a lot more experience with women and worked over, with over hundreds of women. So I have really changed my views on specific things, but the fundamentals are kind of the same. Especially regarding past suggestions like fatty fish and nuts for fat sources, limiting sugar, and eating cruciferous vegetables. So the biggest thing for me is not you need to restrict foods. I never want to create food fear. It's more don't overdo it on fish and nuts. The thing is when you're eating a handful of nuts, it's very different than eating 15 cookies made out of almond flour. You would never eat that many nuts in one sitting, yet we do it very regularly now that there's nut cheeses, nut milk, nut products on the market. So I always just say, like, if you're going to do nuts, make sure they're whole nuts or nut butter, and you're doing a limited amount, and experiment. See if you feel good with your fats coming from nuts as opposed to your fats coming from saturated fats. And it goes the same thing for fatty fish. I don't restrict fatty fish, but I don't consume it like every single day. I just make sure to get a balance, just like I would in nature. I wouldn't go and frickin' fish some salmon every single day. Like I would probably do it once a week and consume salmon that same day and then go back to my normal diet. So and then cruciferous vegetables. I'm not against cruciferous vegetables at all. I'm just against taking a lot of DIM if it's making you feel crazy or it's making your hair fall out. Cruciferous vegetables are fine. They just must be well cooked. And I don't think that you need to be eating like 5 servings a day. Sorry for all the questions. If we can't tolerate dairy, can lactose enzyme tablets or lactose-free dairy be used in the meantime to still consume dairy for calcium? Yeah, absolutely. Remember, the goal is to actually build up the ability to create lactase enzymes, and if you don't consume lactose, you probably won't. But if, like, long-term you're just not digesting it well, but you digest lactose-free dairy, that's fine. It's just the lactose actually plays a role in keeping it balanced. So you actually want to make sure your milk does have protein, carb, and fat, and the carb does come from the sugar source, which is lactose. So maybe in the meantime it's a good kind of substitute, but obviously you want to get to the point where you can consume true dairy. Recommendations on how to get your gut healthy. Yeah, I mean, this is like something that is, so overhyped in like the mainstream like blog and health and wellness sphere. A lot of people are like, you need to take my probiotic and you need to drink, eat sauerkraut and you need to do this. And I'm like, no. You need to get to the bottom of what pathogens are in your gut. If you have small intestinal bacteria overgrowth symptoms, get a breath test done. If you have any digestive issues, get a comprehensive stool test done. Whether it's the GI map or the doctor's data or the Genova diagnostics, you need to know what's in your gut. Guessing is going to waste your time and your money. You're going to end up spending, I know these tests are expensive, but you're going to end up spending thousands of dollars on supplements and frustration if you just try to heal your gut blind. So I just recommend getting to the bottom of what's going on and then doing a protocol based on what's going on. And if it's fungus, it's going to be different than if it's an overgrowth of bacteria, if it's H. pylori, if it's, it's going to be completely different. And so it's just best to just get it tested and know what's in your gut. And it's going to be an investment, so save up for it and then just do it. Because it's one of those things where you can go in blind for sure, but you're going to be frustrated and you're going to probably end up not getting the results that you want. And then the way that you heal the gut is remove the stressors. I remove very irritating inflammatory foods that the body is having a hard time digesting, all the while implementing nutrient-dense, easy-to-digest food sources like broths and collagen and saturated fats, restoring digestive enzyme, hydrochloric acid. Pretty much the rule is when you're restoring gut function, you restore from the mouth down. So if, for example, if you're trying to work on your small intestine, but you don't have any stomach acid, good luck. So it's like one of those things where I recommend starting with the mouth, get the mouth really clean, oil pull every morning, tongue scrape your tongue, floss your teeth, brush with a natural toothpaste, and then get that habit down, get the mouth nice and clean. And then work on the stomach, digestive enzymes, digestive juices, hydrochloric acid, that kind of thing. Really work on that. And remember, it's a chain reaction from the mouth down. So as you heal the mouth, you're going to start to see the stomach improve. And as you heal the stomach, you're going to start to see the gallbladder and the liver improve and so on and so forth. And so I always work from the mouth down. But yeah, it's definitely not something that like can be done. Like if someone tries to convince you that you just need to do this to heal your gut, you should run so far in the other direction. Because, somebody needs to keep your health history into account as well. Like if you took 18 rounds of antibiotics before you were 3 years old, your gut is wrecked, so it's like, but if you were, vaginally born and breastfed and you never had antibiotics until older in your life, you're going to have a very different gut than someone that was not fed very well as a child and got multiple rounds of antibiotics and that kind of thing. So it's just important to know the health history, to know how much gut healing has to occur, and then also to pay attention to the symptoms. Are your symptoms super bad? How to correct low estrogen with food. Sometimes the biggest problem is low progesterone. So I'd hope that you got your progesterone checked as well and it was above 8 nanograms per milliliter mid-luteal phase. A lot of times people don't realize that low progesterone leads to low estrogen. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is make sure you're getting enough carbs. That's one of the biggest things, especially if you've lost your period. Carbs are super important for that. Sometimes women who've lost their period or have low estrogen need up to like 150 grams of carbohydrates per day to get their bodies like back to ovulating again. Because I'm assuming if you just have I'm assuming that you don't have a period, but maybe you just have a slightly low estrogen, and it kind of goes the same. You need extra carbohydrates. You need to make sure you're eating enough, period, eating more frequently, make sure your stress hormones aren't high, cortisol, adrenaline, prolactin, make sure your thyroid's okay. Like I said, TSH is not the marker. You want to look for how T4 is being converted into T3. And those are like my main issues. Low estrogen is usually not the problem. It's like a million other problems causing low estrogen, but it's usually a stress issue. So that's kind of like what I look for when there's low estrogen. Hey girl, I got discoloration in skin folds, my neckline, armpit, elbows. How do I get rid of it? It could be an estrogen thing. A lot of times people don't realize that estrogen is not stored in the bloodstream. It is stored in the tissues. And so people are like, I have low estrogen or I have normal estrogen, and they have clear estrogen's dominant symptoms. And I'm like, do you have enough progesterone to get that estrogen out of your tissues? Because progesterone plays a role in estrogen detox. And so when we don't have enough progesterone, a lot of times, eventually it will show up as low estrogen on our blood test, but it's not low estrogen. There's no estrogen being mobilized to the liver, which is a bigger problem. So, anytime there's dark like armpits, dark groin area, dark skin folds, that's usually an estrogen issue. So I recommend just really focusing on liver detoxification, making sure you're getting estrogen out, and then also making sure you're ovulating in order to make enough progesterone to balance that estrogen out. I had discoloration in my armpits and my groin forever, and I understand that it's very embarrassing and it's frustrating. But as I improved my health, as I improved my detoxification, as I increased my progesterone levels and made sure I was ovulating, the discoloration started to slowly fade. And now, my armpits are hairy, sorry, but not dark any longer. So it takes time. These things are not going to be like instant fixes. I apologize for that, but that's how it works. And so it's a systemic issue and needs to be looked at as why it's happening. And usually it's because of an estrogen issue. Exact question I asked functional doctor today. Where do I get my protein then? So frustrating. Thanks for your help. Makes way more sense to me. So glad. How would you know if you have overgrowth bacteria in the small intestine? I recommend Googling small intestinal bacteria overgrowth or SIBO to see the symptoms if they align. A lot of times constipation, diarrhea, IBS is all caused by small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, undigested food in your stool, floating stools, like diarrhea when you're stressed out, like if things are fastly moving through your body, there's probably an issue there. Bloating specifically after meals, especially if it's like green vegetables, cruciferous vegetables, raw vegetables, you're not digesting them well, or you're bloating after you eat them, probably small intestinal issues. Why is my ovulation painful and comes with water retention while my period is completely painless and my weight drops dramatically? Probably have a high estrogen during the follicular phase, so remember, you get 2 spikes of estrogen in your cycle. Like a couple of days leading up to ovulation, your estrogen will get your main spike to kind of bring on ovulation. And then after progesterone spikes after ovulation, you'll get another estrogen spike a little bit. It's not going to be as high as that first spike. But if you're not detoxifying well, estrogen's well, you get that first estrogen spike and there's just a lot of estrogen hanging around the body. Estrogen equals inflammation. Just think of it that way. Estrogen, inflammation. Estrogen, inflammation, specifically to your reproductive organs. Hence why the body raises testosterone when there's high estrogen, because it's the only thing protective against estrogen. And estrogen is so damaging to the reproductive tissue. So you would want to really hyper-focus on detoxification the first half of your cycle and then see if that affects your ovulation. And you'll probably find that it will affect your ovulation. This drink right here, this chlorophyll drink, is perfect. Milk thistle, turmeric, ginger, just kind of really focusing on liver detox and see if that helps. And it usually does. And then also you need enough salt. Make sure you're getting plenty of Himalayan pink salt, Celtic sea salt. Histamine intolerance. Yeah, is that a question? I'm not really sure. Thank you. I knew there was a piece of big picture today. Can you tackle all gut bacteria at once? SIBO, parasites, fungus. Yes, you can. It just kind of, you have to figure out what came first, the chicken or the egg, and I do the mouth down thing. So if small intestinal bacteria overgrowth is the biggest thing causing symptoms, we usually tackle that. We start tackling that first while we're kind of tackling. But the nice thing about bacteria and fungus is a lot of the herbals kill all three, and so you'll end up killing the other one even though you're working on one. But it's really important to work mouth down, because a lot of people focus on the large intestine, and I'm like, girl, that's going to take some time. You got to work from the mouth all the way down, because let's say, for example, you don't build up your stomach acid. And so you go and you're trying to like kill parasites, and you eat parasites and viruses all the time, you guys. It's on your vegetables, it's in your meat, it's everywhere. And so your stomach acid is supposed to be that first line of defense. And so you're like killing all of the pathogens in the large intestine, and then you're like getting more just coming in through the stomach. And I'm like, no, we can't do that. So we got to like remember, the mouth is the flower of your digestion, and then we got to work mouth down, and we'll get there. You can tackle them all at once, but they can sometimes be too much. It just really depends on what's going on. Are you familiar with Microbiome Labs, Mega Mucosa, Mega Prebiotic, and Mega Sporebiotic? If so, how do you feel about them for supporting gut health? I really love them. There's only a few probiotics that I really use and love, and I don't use them all the time. Remember, you shouldn't be just like supplementing bacteria like a crazy person. But they are very effective, and spore-based probiotics tend to be my favorite. Best source of probiotics. The thing about probiotics, you guys, is like a lot of people just think the more probiotics, the better. And this is like I think this is why so many people are struggling with small intestinal bacteria overgrowth nowadays, is they just like went crazy with the probiotics, and they didn't have really good hydrochloric acid function. And so there was like live bacteria getting from their mouth into their small intestine. And I know that was like sounded like the thing you want, but you actually want to be feeding your bacteria. And you don't really want any bacteria in the small intestine whatsoever. You want it kind of making its way to the large intestine. And if not, you want it dying before it hits the small intestine so it can feed the bacteria in the large intestine. Because remember that bugs eat bugs. It's gross. It's like a food chain. So I don't really recommend supplementing with a crazy amount of probiotics when you have gut issues. Like, a lot of women find that it makes them bloat more. It makes them have like worse histamine intolerance. It makes them have anxiety. It irritates their sleep, that kind of thing. There's a time and a place for probiotics. And then after you take a round, you just kind of want to maintain with some fermented foods here and there. But I really am very careful with probiotics, and a lot more conservative than most practitioners, because I don't think like just like putting your like 50 billion rogue bacteria strains in your body is a great idea when you're very digestively impaired. Like, does that make any common sense to you? No. How to support fat and protein digestion. Yeah, I mean, you got to make sure that you have good hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes in the stomach, and then you got to make sure that your gallbladder is flowing. Okay, I have one more question, and Instagram is cutting me off, and I'll have to go live again. Remember, I always go live for another hour, so if I didn't get to your question, ask it again, and I'll get to it, but I'm going to read one more question. I had itchy reactions consuming collagen peptides in powder form. Is that normal? Can collagen be allergic? Unfortunately, that can be totally a histamine intolerance if there was like hives or an itchy reaction. A lot of times it's that your body cannot tolerate the histamine. It's not clearing histamine well. So in that case, you just kind of want to I do Beeler's broth, like a very like rich mineral vegetable broth, and then see if you can tolerate regular bone broth. I just recommend, when people have histamine intolerance, doing bone broth that's only apple cider vinegar, salt, and bones, and not doing any like onions or garlic or anything like that until the digestion is better off. Your answers are so detailed and thoughtful. Thank you. If somebody else is getting that collagen issue, the itchy hives, that's usually a histamine issue. It's a breakdown issue. Like, you don't need to restrict histamines. You need to get your gut better functioning. All right, join me again. Sorry, Instagram's going to cut me off, and I don't want to be cut off. I'll see you in a second.